Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'sukkot divrei Torah. Baruch na Adonai Eloheinu divrei Toratcha b'filu pi beit Yisrael. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאיך בית ישראל. כולנו יודע שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני לומד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם. אשר ברך בנו מכל עמים. ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
So we're going to just do the shir in the refuah of Ian Shapiro, who's at the moment in a ventilator from COVID. His Hebrew name is Yisrael ben Sipora. So he goes to our Gemara shir with Rav Schottenstein, who is a good friend of ours. And it's a very long road. I mean, he's been stable but serious. So it doesn't automatically, the minute you come on the ventilator, you come off. You know, it's quite a serious thing.
Yeah. He's such a good guy, such a nice guy.
Fantastic guy. So
yeah,
we'll do the tour for his refuah. Now Kevin's just going to start with a bit of halacha from the Chofetz Chaim.
Okay, I'm just. Did we finish with at number 10? A witness shall not rise up against a man.
Yes.
Is that what you did last time? Okay, okay. Yeah, next one, number 11. You shall not follow a multitude to do evil. In Shmot chapter 23, verse 2. If you join a group to speak or hear Lashon Hara, you violate this prohibition. Okay, continue. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. You shall not act you should not act similar to Korach and his company. And this is from Bamidbar. This verse forbids us to maintain disputes. Sanhedrin. If you will cause the continuation of a quarrel by relating Lashon Hara, you violate this prohibition. So you shouldn't perpetuate a dispute. These things are all easier said than done. Obviously, this is the ideal to aim for. Eh?
Sure. I think what we should bear in mind is that when it brings up this thing in Sanhedrin, Gavin and I learned it in Chelek, where about people that will inherit Olam Haba and those that won't. And obviously, Korach is not one of those lucky few. The problem is that there's two different types of argument. The one is l'shem, which means for Hashem's name. In other words, sometimes you have to stand up for what's right in a dignified way and make it about the issue, not the person. But the thing of it is sometimes ego that gets involved and personalities, etc., in even what you call clean disputes. In other words, for the right reasons, but it gets marred. And that's for self-driven personal motivation. It says in Kabb, you do not use a spade of the Torah to dig your point of view, meaning that you've got to see how productive it is to have machlokes. Yes, obviously Kevin's 100% right. Sometimes you can't fight it. You have an argument with somebody because you're just dealing with very difficult people and the normal human condition. But the key of it is, firstly, is not to perpetuate it by speaking Lashon Hara, as Kevin said, and further to which, to try and see if you can resolve it and be the, the bigger person, if possible. Some people you can only end up having a cordial relationship with, but it's better than going to war. Some people you'll never be friends with, and some people you can never maintain that sort of relationship because they're toxic. But within that, they don't have to become your sworn enemy. So, Kev, thanks, man. I appreciate you reading that. Much appreciated. All right, we left off yesterday, and it was more than yesterday. Firstly, great to see you off. We were very worried, and we're still davening for your health. I'm still putting you into my davening, and I just need you to look after yourself. I know you can't respond, but this year is also in the merit of your health, really. Okay, so I tell you where we ended off not yesterday, when we did the share on Thursdays. We were discussing the question of, we were exploring different topics, and we say basically, is there any of the Tanaim that don't use the principle of a dayu to completely nullify a kol v'chomer, with the very least restrain it? Are there some that don't apply it at all? Because as we see that the major difference of opinion between Rabbi Talfel and the rabbis is the rabbis will use a dayu, it is sufficient to even nullify kol v'chomer because their principle is to apply a dayu in all cases, as in the scriptural edict, that when there's a kol v'chomer, you apply a dayu. And Rabbi Talmud says, no, we don't apply a dayu when you come out with nothing from a kol v'chomer. When you come out with at least something, there's a point to it. So that's where we were holding, and we were going through different arguments, like, for example, a zav, touching and carrying, etc. And what we did do is we discussed that there seemed to be a case where Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, there seems to be a Tana that doesn't actually hold by the principle of it is sufficient. Even when the Kol V'chomer is not completely nullified by applying that principle. So what I'm going to do is we did touch on it. I'm just going to do a 2-minute review, and hopefully this will be helpful. I've got 11 Chumash sources, bless you, Gav, to share with you today, 11. And then in our famous catchphrase line, we've got more sources than an Italian restaurant. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So how we ended up is as follows. It was taught in the Brisa, where it is known to us that a mat contracts tumah in the case of contact with a human corpse. Okay. Now, the problem there is very, very clear, is that even though we learned it in the Brisa, we've got a particular problem. Because what was the question mark? Do any of you remember?
Just say that again. Sorry, I lost my concentration for a second. 1 second.
No problem.
There's something outside. Sorry, go ahead.
So whenever there's a kol v'chomer, okay, it brings up a kol v'chomer because clearly kol v'chomer is logic. There's 2 ways to learn. There's via scriptural sourcing or via svara, which is logic. Okay, those are your only 2 ways to learn. Logic or scriptural sourcing. The kol v'chomer falls into which category?
That's sourcing.
No, logic. Because we say, is it not logical that based on this principle that should be applied in this particular case? It's under one of the categories of logic.
But they always find a source for it. They don't just
no. I'm saying hear this carefully. I'm just going to put it again.
Actually, both, in my opinion. Sorry.
No. It's a good point. I'm saying generally you should have both. You should have logic and you should have sources. But what happens with a kol v'chomer is we have to apply logic because there's no source in that particular target area. So what we do with a kol v'chomer is we say, look, we need to get laws from somewhere else that illustrate this point and can be applied in this situation. And when it's applied in this situation based on a logical deduction, an application to the target area based on the source area. Now, the source area is not the exact area which comes into question, because otherwise we'd have a scriptural source for it. The very fact that we bring it up as a kol v'chomer means there's an unknown quantity. There's a question mark in that particular area. Otherwise, there'd be no need for any logical derivation whatsoever.
Correct, but I was referring 100%. So what you're saying is that, and I agree with you, that's exactly what I was getting at. So there's no source for the unknown. So you find another source which is kind of similar, and then you expound logic in order to
correct. So you were correct in that.
So that's what I was referring to the source, not to the target. But the target is unknown. I agree with you. Sorry.
No. But Gavin's right. In order to have logic has to be based on sourcing. It can't just be logic alone, preferably. In other words, the more you've got working for you, the stronger your reasoning is. So when you bring a legal case forward, you use previous legal cases as history to illustrate your point. You might come up with a great logical argument, but if it hasn't been tried and tested in law, the judge won't allow it. You have to basically say, when we've had a previous legal case, the exact same situation came up, and I'm applying this particular case in 1987, Roe versus Wade, etc. This was the case, and we use logic to have previous case histories with things that are similar and try and apply principles on that. So Gavin is completely right. It's sourcing and logic, but the area in question doesn't have a scriptural source in the Chumash, and that's why it's a question mark.
Yeah, correct.
So with this kol v'chomer, just put a thumbs up after if it's making sense. Okay, good. So So what we're learning here is it says, for it was taught in the Brisa, from where is it known to us that a mat contracts tumah in the case of contact with a human corpse? Okay, because that's a question mark. There's no specific Chumash source about a mat contracting tumah from a corpse. That's an unknown factor. How do we know it's an unknown factor? That's how the Kol V'Chomer starts. Because what happens is, as we've discussed, when the Israelite army returned, basically they tore into the Midianites and they had a victorious campaign. But then when they came back, they killed many of them. And they had to purify themselves from corpse tumah, and they had to obviously take every garment, every leather utensil, everything made of goat materials, and every wooden utensil, and purify it, because to the victor goes the spoils, meaning that they get to keep the, what do you call it, the booty of war, so to speak. So what I want to do is share my screen.
Largesse, I think.
Yeah, largesse is a word that implies something a little bit different. When you say you're relying on people's largesse, you're relying on their kindness, their generosity of spirit. That's slightly different.
Oh, okay. Largesse, the largesse. Okay.
Yeah.
I must check that out. Okay.
So, just hang on for me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen for the biblical source. Okay. Let me just share my screen. Tell me, guys, if you got it. Let me share it now. Okay. All right. Just while we're on the subject, Kev, largesse, generosity in bestowing money or gifts upon others.
Okay,
that's why I don't know the word, because this is very rarely happened to me in practice. Otherwise, I'd know the word. Next time people are throwing things at me and giving me gifts, I say, stop the largesse. How do you pronounce it?
Largesse.
Largesse.
Chess.
Chess. Yeah. All right. So, all right, guys, I wanted to just share with you the biblical source. If you go to Bamidbar, chapter 31, verse 20 and 19. Just, Gav, you want to read it?
Sure. Just the English though, eh?
Yeah.
You shall then stay outside the camp 7 days. Everyone among you or among your captors who have slain a person or touched a corpse shall cleanse himself on the 3rd and 7th days. Next one as well.
Yeah.
Is it just one line? I can't see.
Yeah, it's one line.
Can you scroll it? Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to scroll it. I can't. You have to. You shall also cleanse every cloth, every article of skin, anything made of goat's hair, and every object of wood.
Correct. Okay, so there we learn about all the materials that you need to cleanse and make sure they are purified. Now, it doesn't mention there the word mat, as you can see. So that's your area of question mark. That's where we have to get the Kol V'Chomer. Now, sorry, we're going to go back to that now. I'm just stopping my screen share. All right. So I hope that's been a little bit helpful. Kev, I didn't mean to correct you there. I just wanted
no, it's okay. That's no, you don't bother. That's, then I use it in the wrong context. It's good. I thought good. Thank you. And it's good for me to know that.
Sure. So basically, elsewhere in the Torah, it indicates. So all right. So firstly, we know that there's no mention of mat. Then that's the question mark. So it says it's basically a logical derivation. In other words, a Kol V'Chomer. If small earthenware vials, which are tahor, which is pure, in the case of a zav, they become tameh in the case of a contact with a human corpse. Then isn't it logically compelling that a mat which becomes tameh, impure in the case of a zav, becomes tameh in the case of a human corpse? So let me just break that Kol V'Chomer down. So if small earthenware vials, which are pure in the case of the zav. Now, guys, do you remember why small earthenware vials are pure in the case of the zav?
Yeah, if if your finger can't fit in. But that's to do with the corpse.
No, that's correct. No, that's absolutely
Zav
correct.
as well. Zav as well.
No. This is what it's saying. This is exactly what it's saying. It's saying that, look, if you want to say that, look, a Zav transmits tumor either through touching it or moving it, and you can't move something unless you touch it. So he takes. So that's the term used. If you're sitting or leaning, which is madras, that also is infected with tumor. Are you with me? So the only thing that doesn't get infected is a container, because a zav can't touch the inner contents because the opening is way too small. It's a tiny valve. So if the opening is large, then it would become absolutely infected. But since it's too small for the zav to infect, he doesn't infect it by touching the outside, because the outside you can just purify. You've got to wait until evening and make sure it's purified and mikvah it or toivel it or whatever, but it's fine because he hasn't infected the inner contents. He can't get to the inner contents. That's basically what it's saying. So if small earthenware vials, which are pure in the case of a zav, become impure in contact with the human corpse. Now, what do we mean that they become impure in contact with the human corpse? All right, this is what we mean. I'm going to just share my screen, guys, and you'll see the biblical sourcing for it. Now, share it with you. Just give me 1 second. Do you want to read it, Kev? This is the ritual.
Sure. This is the ritual. When a person dies in a tent, whoever enters the tent and whoever is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days.
Correct. Continue.
And every open vessel with no lid fastened down shall be unclean.
Great. So we learn from there very, very simply that in the case of a vessel, if it's open, then it can contract tumor from a corpse. How? Well, there's 2 ways a corpse can infect something, either by touching it, but we learn in this case it's not touching it, because firstly, if a living person can't stick any of his body parts or fingers in there or anything else, a dead person is just the same anatomy as a live person. He's not going to be able to do it either. So the only way it can infect the container is if it's in a tent, this open vessel, and it contracts through what you call air contamination or air tumor. And then you have to smash the open vessel if it doesn't have a lid. If it's sealed, it's sealed. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So what I was going to say to you is as follows. I just want to basically read on and then tell you.
Doesn't the finger thing apply here as well? If it's got an opening that's smaller than a finger, it's also
That's
not.
you're exactly right. So what we're saying is, yeah, exactly that. Is that a tumor of a dead body can infect an object through air contamination, just like almost obviously we understand it with the coronavirus, is that it doesn't have to stick its body part in. A zav can infect something by touching it directly, and a corpse can infect something by touching it directly. But the difference is a corpse within a tent will infect everything within that tent, and an open vial with even the smallest hole will be contaminated through air tumor. So this is what we're saying, exactly as you're saying, Damon. The small earthenware vials, which are pure in the case of a zav, become impure in the case of contact with a human corpse. Then isn't it logically compelling that a mat, which becomes impure in the case of a zav, becomes impure in the case of a human corpse? So they're saying, listen, if a zav remains definitely clean, a container, because he can't infect it, with air contamination of a corpse is going to infect that container, then surely when we learn of a case where a zav that infects a mat by lying on it, obviously that corpse tumor is worse. And even being in the same tent as a dead corpse, the corpse doesn't even have to lie on it, it's going to infect it. Does that make sense? And what's the proof? Read this, Gavin.
Anyone who touches his bedding will wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening.
And then whoever sits on an object
on which the one with the discharge has sat shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening.
Correct. So what are we learning from there? We're learning from there the case of a Zav. Okay, that's exactly what we're learning. So we're learning that a Zav infects his bedding. So what is a known quantity? That a Zav infects bedding. So what is a mat? A mat is something that somebody walks on or lies on. It's not considered a utensil like a container. So we don't have a status in the Torah for what happens with a human corpse and the tameh with the mat. But we're saying, if an open container which a zav doesn't infect is infected by a human corpse, then surely a mat which is infected by a human corpse, by a zav, is definitely going to be infected by a human corpse. Does that make sense? Do you understand how the Kabb works?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So, Gavin, do you want to give it over?
Sure.
Sure.
So basically what's happening here is that we've got a scenario where we don't know what happens to a mat in the environment of like a tent, for example, where there's a dead body, where there's a corpse. So what happens to that mat if that mat's sitting there? So because it's an unknown, there's no scriptural source stating what happens to a mat. It only says goat skin and wooden objects and various things like that were taken, have to sit and will get washed and stay outside the camp for 7 days. So in this particular case, we don't know what to do. So we use the Bava Kamma, whereby we take the fact that a mat is infected by Zav, and certain earthenware are not infected by the Zav at all, unless touched. But if it's not touched, they're not infected. However, earthenware in a tent where there's a corpse are by default, due to the air contamination, automatically, if they're open and not sealed, and if the hole is big enough to fit a finger, are by default exposed to the corpse and are infected and become tameh. So we can use the Bava Kamma and say, well, even more so, a mat that is infected by Zav lying on it, by default will automatically, in the environment of a corpse, if the vessels get infected, even more so the mat in that environment will just the same, will be infected. But not finished. Not finished is another part. But we have to look at the fact that the mat won't be for 7 days, even though it should be, because of the limitation of the dayu, which says that the target can't be more than the source. So the source is only 1 day not even 1 day. I think it's just till evening. You have to wash the mat and then till evening. So the same will apply to the mat in the environment of a corpse. In the environment of a corpse. That's it.
Okay, so I think you have it perfect. I think the one thing that you've got to bear in mind is they don't say, this is the entire point. They say that the mat is susceptible for 7 days, which that's where the issue is, because Rav Achav Defti says to Ravina, listen, he never applied a dayu here, because Gavin's completely correct. If he applied a dayu, the mat should only be tameh until evening after being purified, because it should take the source, which is the zav, to the target area, which is the question mark of which we don't know how a human corpse affects a mat. And therefore, it should, since zav is the source, it should come to make a mat in the presence of a human corpse, in the tent of a human corpse, susceptible for tumah only until evening after being cleansed. And the very fact that it doesn't seem to discern and say the mat is impure for 7 days, implies by Rav Achav Defti that there's a problem here, that he doesn't seem to apply the rule of it is sufficient. That's exactly the point. Yeah. And you're dead on the mark. This is why I brought this case, is it doesn't seem to be applying the dayu. And you're right, it should.
I actually forgot about that. Sorry, I read it a while.
No. You said it great.
Week or something. Sorry.
So just in summary, you said it perfectly. A zav renders a susceptible item impure until evening. A corpse renders it impure for 7 days. So the Tana has an introductory statement. From where do we learn that a mat contracts tumah, impurity, from a human corpse? He means to equate the tumah of a mat found under the same roof as a corpse with the tumah of any other utensil found there, which is tumah for 7 days. That's according to Rashi here. So the Kal V'chomer would run as follows. A corpse transmits tumah more readily than a zav, from evidence by a small earthenware valve, who contracts tumah from a corpse, but not from a zav, because the opening is too small for human touch, but not too small for air contamination. So if a mat contracts tumah until evening from a zav, then does the Kal V'chomer not dictate that it should contract tumah for 7 days from a corpse? And what should happen here is there should be a diet that says, since we're using the source of the zav, it should only be impure in the target area until evening. So that's exactly what Rav Acha of Defti said to Ravina. Exactly what Gavin said. Gavin, that was spot on.
Thanks.
That was spot on.
So
So
I wasn't
now,
100%. At the end, I didn't get it. There's a control.
no, listen, but you got 99.9, and
Yeah,
I think you did great.
All right, thank you.
So it says the Gemara now shows how this indicates that the ton of the Brisa doesn't subscribe to diet at all. Now, why should we be able to derive this Kal V'chomer that a corpse makes the mat tamei impure for 7 days? Say instead that the Kal V'chomer helps for teaching us that the mat contracts tumah until evening, which was hitherto unknown, and it is sufficient helps from excluding the mat from tumah for 7 days, since this stringency is not possessed by the source law of the zav. Do we not see then that this Tana does not apply dayo even when something will remain of the Kal V'chomer teaching after dayo's application? So what we're saying here is even Rabbi Talmud would be happy, because the question mark is we didn't know the infection of a mat. What we're saying is even if you apply the law of the zav, we still know that the mat would be infected until evening. And therefore, we would still come away with something, even if we didn't make it infected for 7 days. So that would have made even Rabbi Talmud happy, who sometimes doesn't apply the dayu. So in this case, it doesn't seem that even after learning something with the dayu applied, that they've even seen reason to put a dayu. So this seems kind of unusual. So the Gemara answers, Ravina replied to Rav Acha of Defti as follows. He said, listen, I've heard this from the Chumia ben Zacharia, okay, and he already had this discussion with the buyer. And the buyer answered him that the Tana of this brisa derives the susceptibility of a mat to corpse tumah from the law of sheretz to a different derivation. Okay, we're going to have to understand how this works. So say, look, there was a particular reason that it wasn't applied in this case. Okay, so this was what this is how a buyer answered him. And as regard the derivation mentioned in the brisa itself, a buyer amends the brisa, and this is what the Tana actually says. From where is it known to us that a mat contracts tumah in the case of contact with a sheretz? It's a logical derivation, a Kal V'chomer. If small earthenware vials, which appear in the case of a zav, become tamei impure in the case of a sheretz, is it not logically compelling that a mat which becomes impure in the case of a zav becomes impure in the case of contact with a sheretz? Okay, so we're going to break this down as follows. This is the new part. Is that firstly, I just want to explain to you what a sheretz is. It's basically in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 11, verse 29 to 30. So I just want to share my screen with you guys.
Like a rodent?
Yeah, it's one of the categories. Okay. Gab, why don't you read it?
From the following.
Yeah.
The following shall be unclean for you from among the things that swarm on the earth: the mole, the mouse, the great lizards of every variety. The gecko, Damon, shame you love those things. The land crocodile, the lizard, you like that too. The sand lizard, I'm sure you can grow to like that, and the chameleon. Those for you, those are for you the unclean among all the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening.
Now you should have a very big question here, guys. You should have a very big question.
Crocodile.
No. I'm going to highlight it.
But Damon, before you proceed, this only applies in the times of the temple. Does it still apply in our modern days?
No, because one of the things we don't have is we don't have the paraduma, for one thing, to be able to rectify the uncleanness from a human corpse. A lot has changed.
We all tuma anyway at the moment.
We're all tuma. Even Gavin.
So this is interesting. I know the answer. I know what you're getting at. And you highlighted it, so that helps a bit. So the problem is that it's not for 7 days. It's only for till the evening. It's different to a dead corpse.
Exactly. So what does unclean until evening seem like?
It seems like a zab, same thing.
Exactly. So what is the problem? I want you to articulate it. Excellent.
So the problem is that the example they're using is not similar to a dead body in a tent, because that's for 7 days. That's where the problem comes in.
Exactly. Kev, do you understand the problem?
Yeah.
So the
how can it be?
Is not
sorry,
great.
How can you say it's 7 days if it says explicitly there only until evening?
Yes. So what we have is we have a problem. You want to tell me that the whole problem we had with the zav is it's impure until evening, and then they make all of a sudden the mat from a human corpse 7 days, and you say that dio isn't applied; it's a full 7 days. Then you want to come and give me that a sheretz seems to be a stronger proof, but the biggest problem is the sheretz is exactly the same as the zav in one respect, is that anything that it infects is tuma until evening. So how is it stronger than a zav? In other words, if you want to say that, listen, in other words, you can say one of two things here. Either the dio doesn't apply, it is sufficient, and then Abaya would say fine, but Abaya implies that I'm going to give you an example from Sheretz, which proves that you do keep 7 days. But then we're looking at this, and it says the Sheretz is impure until evening. So it's saying if you're not going to apply the dio in the case of the zav, what difference does it make in the sheretz? Because they're both in the same category.
And also, isn't there a difference? Don't you have to touch a sheretz?
Well, listen, it's the same. In fact, a zav is even more stronger than a sheretz, and I'll prove it to you quickly. Just quickly, is that it says in Kalim, Mishnah 1st to the 3rd, there are things that infect by touching, and there are things that infect by carrying. So, a sheretz, semen of a human male, and touching a dead corpse infects by touching. Okay? It infects by touching. Now, a zav fluid, his spittle and his semen infect by touching and carrying. In other words, you're carrying something with his spit on. So a zav is even stronger than a sheretz. So why bring a weaker example? It's even weaker, because it doesn't infect by carrying, but at the very least it's equal. They both have a limitation on impure until evening, whereas a corpse is until 7 days. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and also sheretz is not exposure. It's like you say, just touching. And I was actually getting to the carrying part as well. But thank you. So and the problem is that it's just touching. It's not even touching and carrying. So like you say,
but they're going to bring a sheretz for one reason, is that the sheretz can infect a vial of the sheretz. If the size of a lentil falls within a vial with a tiny, tiny lid, you have to smash the container, smash it, okay, and throw the container away, it's infected. Whereas a zav is too clumsy and big to get his body part in there. So they use the sheretz because of the amount that you need. Even a human corpse, you need the size of an olive to infect it. Whereas a sheretz, you only need a small grain.
So you're saying that containers don't have to actually physically touch the sherrod if they're just in the vicinity, or what?
No. What I'm saying is, if with the sherrod, if a tiny lizard tail the size of a lentil falls within that, which it can fall within a tiny lid, a tiny valve, it would infect the contents and you have to smash the container. But a zav, because it's so small, can't get himself in there. Same with a human corpse. So a human corpse can infect it from air contamination, and a sherrod from something the size of a lentil. So that's why they're coming to bring a sherrod. So we're going to see now. That's number one.
No, but I'm saying sherrod has to only be by touch. Eh? It's not from air transmission.
It's not from air.
It has to actually touch that vessel. Eh?
It has to touch. So that's another problem, is it's not the same. And then also your other problem is that in certain ways it's not even as stringent as a zav. But we've got one other issue here. Sherrod, Kev, are you awake?
Yeah.
Sherrod.
Okay.
All right. Don't worry, you've got 2 minutes.
No, I'm fine. I'm just tired. I've been.
Okay, so just quickly, what it's going to come prove is this concept of Gezeira, Shava, and Hekesh. So Gezeira, Shava, and Hekesh is scriptural sourcing that's stronger than a Kol V'chomer, than logic. And we're going to come and see how they prove that with the sherrods. So if you use different tools, so it's called homeomatic tools. There are 13 principles, and they're stronger than a Kol V'chomer, a Gezeira, Shava, and a Hekesh, especially what you call a Gezeira, Shava that's impervious on both sides to criticism. Then you can't use a logical refutation. But we'll go through that tomorrow. But it's not going to use a Kol V'chomer base initially. It's going to try, but it's going to come and prove that you need a Gezeira, Shava, and a Hekesh.
Because Gezeira means decreed. It's that's why it's stronger.
Yes, it's using different tools which are much stronger. You are correct. So, all right, guys, we did nice here.
Shkach.
And I wish you a good day.
And we didn't even need, we got 1 minute left, and we didn't even need the extra time. So well done to everybody.
Gavin,
well done.
you were spot on. I don't know what drugs you took. I want them.
Gavin, you could take the share. He could fill in for you one day.
No,
let's say you're off one day, you need to go somewhere, Gavin can take the share.
I'm quite happy to fill in when my bandwidth also shows zero.